Welcome to episode 2 of Nudges and Bridges. Today we're going to be looking at the sporting life, sport, how sports can provide a way for us to find common ground with others that we disagree with. I remember that back in 1964, I started first grade. That really dates me, doesn't it? And in 1964, the Chicago Bears were coming off their NFL championship. This is before the Super Bowl. Again, dating me. And I was starting first grade, which was my first school because kindergarten hadn't been invented either. So this is really, really dating me here today. So, but my parents told my teacher that they weren't sure whether or not I knew my alphabet, but I could give her the starting lineup for the Bears on offense and defense, what number they wore and what college they went to, which was pretty accurate, actually. Many of us start watching sports at a very young age, and we can identify a lot of sports figures at a very young age. And for many of us, following sports is something that we do our entire life. Think of all the popularity, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, hockey, or anything that's in between. So we spend a lot of time with sports, watching sports. Many of us play sports. And I think that it is a source that we may find that is very helpful for us to find common ground. When I was in graduate school, I had a professor named David Messick. And one of the things that he was an experimental psychologist. One of the things that he commented upon was that human beings have an ability to form teams or form units or form connections very quickly on very different issues. And so you could have two people in Illinois. I was going to school at Northwestern in the Chicago area. And I had grown up in downstate Illinois in a farm in downstate Illinois. So when Dave gave this example, it really resonated with me. He said you could have two people, one from the Chicago area and one from downstate Illinois, who are bitterly opposed on all kinds of political and social issues. But then 1 minute later are standing shoulder to shoulder cheering for the Chicago Cubs. And of course, if you're in the really downstate part of Illinois over the west, maybe it's the Cardinals. But so there's those differences too. But his point was that on the one hand, we can be bitterly opposed on a lot of things, socially and politically, but we can also find common ground when it comes to our sporting teams. Now, I recognize that sometimes sporting teams can also have some divisiveness to it. That could happen in a couple of ways. One, it could be your rival, where you really, really dislike your rival. And so there's an us versus them kind of a mentality of we're great and the other side is kind of an evil. I'll talk about rivalries later. In fact, I'm sure that I will spend lots of time talking about sports in these broadcasts, in part because, again, it's part of our nature. When I talk to my students and I ask them to give me an example of a time in which they were able to find a bridge over political differences, overwhelmingly their example comes from being part of a sporting team. And it was in part of that sporting team that they were overcome the differences because they had this other kind of way to identify with other people. And so I think that, sports in that sense is something that is just a very common way that we can identify with each other. So on the one hand, the ways in which there can be a negative us versus them in sports is with the rivals. And again, I'll talk more about that in a later podcast. And the other is that sports can be a wedge issue, has been used as a wedge issue for people who disagree with each other of what the proper rituals are before a game or what one shouldn't do or shouldn't do at a game. And I think that we're all familiar with that. So there can be some use of sports that has some negative divisiveness. But that's true of any of these things. That's true of music, it's true of sports, it's true of religion, it's true of film, it's true of just about anything. And just because there can be a divisive use of any of these things does not mean that we should be silenced about the positive use of them. And so in these podcasts, I'm going to be using or looking at the positive uses of these cultural artifacts as a way to draw us together. Not in the sense that this is always going to be the case, where it's a Pollyannish kind of a thing, but I'm not going to give up the argument to those who just want to use it negatively. I want to insist that there's a way to use it positively as well. Now, I want to give two examples here today. These are supposed to be short. Remember, I have to remind myself of that. The professor can get really talking and talk too much. If you remember in episode 1, I used two films, Sweet Dreams, which depicted post-genocide Rwandan women who came together through music, drumming, and by forming an ice cream business. And I looked at a film, Joyeux Noël, that depicted the World War I truce, where soldiers from both sides came out of the trenches, literally, to with a common ground of music, sports, religion, trading, even a pet. And so I'm going to use two films today that depict other events that I think that go to sports that I think provide an example of how sports can be a common ground. One of them is the film Invictus, starring Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon, which depicts Nelson Mandela's presidency in South Africa. Mandela, of course, had spent decades in prison. Shortly after he got out of prison, or fairly shortly after he got out of prison, he was elected president of South Africa, a very divided country between a majority Black population and a minority white population that had been at serious odds for decades. And there was a great deal of fear of what was going to happen and a great deal of expectation that Mandela was going to, even the scores. One of the more prominent examples of the white minority, and in the views of the Black South Africans, the oppression of the Black perpetrated by the white minority, was the rugby team, the Springboks. And so there was great resentment, anger, maybe even hatred toward rugby generally. The Black population played soccer, not rugby, and to the Springboks and to its colors specifically. And it was more than just a team. It was an icon of things that had been resented. And so there is this bitterness of great favor on one side and great anger on the other side over the Springboks. And so there were movements to try to delegitimize the Springboks, to remove their colors and to put them kind of in their place. And Mandela said, no, we're not going to do that. We need to come together as a nation. And so actually I, Mandela, am going to become the biggest fan of the Springboks as they go into the rugby version of the World Cup. And he rallied and united the entire country behind cheering for the Springboks, which had previously been a highly divisive component of South African society. So it took someone who had great leadership, great stature in order to do it. But at the same time, sport, particularly rugby in this case, became a way for South Africans to unify. So following a sports team can be a way to unify people who were otherwise disagree on serious kinds of issues. Not only disagree, but who had experienced a great deal of oppression and violence and anger. But Mandela was able to use the sports team, rugby, the Springboks, in order to bring the country together. Give a second example. You may remember in the 2018 Olympics that there was a bit of news that North and South Korea marched in together, people were excited with the fact that they were coming in together as one unified country, not unified country, or at least commonly coming in together, presenting themselves. And that very week that they did that, I was showing a film at the Indiana University Cinema. The film was called As One, and what it depicts is the two Koreas coming together in the 90s to join teams for a table tournament, an Asian table tennis tournament. It's kind of tough to say, TTT, table tennis tournament. And I was expecting to, when I watched this film, which is really hard to find, by the way, if you can find As One, you're lucky. It's kind of a hard film to find these days. That it was going to be really hokey and syrupy and all this kind of stuff. Everybody's coming together, blah, blah, blah. It's actually a really good film. And one of the things that it shows is that it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy for the teams to come together. There was a lot of bitterness. There was a lot of resentment. There were fights. There was, this was not an easy melding of people getting together on the same team. The film particularly depicts two women who were fierce rivals in table tennis, who were going to join together to play together on a doubles team, and how difficult it was for them to let go of that rivalry and the resentment with each other. But they found each other to be, finally, human beings with strengths and weaknesses and sufferings and ambitions, and they were able to form actually a very strong team and a very strong friendship. So there's an example of people who were able, like my students talk about, of how to overcome their differences through becoming teammates. That's not to say that they overcame all of their political and social differences, but they made each other human by being teammates. Just as from a fan perspective, Mandela was able to humanize both sides by bringing them together, like my ethics professor was talking about, to be fans of the same team. And so on the one hand, sports can be divisive, and sports can take a dimension of us versus them, though not always, and I'll have other examples of how it can transcend that. And us versus them has some real dangers to it. But at the same time, there is an opportunity to form new kinds of us through sports that has a different sense of what us versus them is about, and might be something that we remember of how we can form bridges with others through sports, either by sharing a team that we cheer for or by becoming teammates ourselves.